I appreciate the warm and rather glowing introduction. Like most introductions, it stressed the high points and happily ignored some of the embarrassing low points. So let me confess at the start that in addition to some of the things that Alan said, I also once had my name on a story on the front page of the Washington Post that described, in some detail I'm sorry to say, an appearance as a spectator at one of the Watergate hearings by a former Prime Minister of Canada who, unfortunately, had been dead for 2 years. I was reminded that most of us don't know as much about Canada as we should. I'm also one of the very few reporters ever accused of having libeled an entire nation. That was Venezuela, a place where I've never been. The Venezuela National Assembly passed a unanimous resolution accusing me of gross and vile libel against every single person in the country, 14 million of them. The story was accurate, but as a reminder that people sometimes get scratchy about things that are written about them. And that's something actually that I learned at the Rutland Herald a long time ago. In fact, I learned almost everything that I learned about reporting right here in Vermont. It was here that I learned that reporters really did need to go out and double check and verify everything. The fact that somebody says something or that an official record states something doesn't mean that it's so. For example, if any of you were to check my own birth certificate, which is still on file at the State Record Center in Middlesex, you see it says I'm a woman. And the date of birth also is wrong. Now, I was in the newspaper business back when it was a good business to be in. Most newspapers made a lot of money. A lot of them did pretty good journalism, and it was more fun than anything else that I wanted to do. But right now, newspapers are in very deep trouble, and that brings us to the subject of today's talk, which is who holds the government accountable when there are no more newspapers. This, by the way, is not my own title. It's what the ACLU asked me to talk about. I don't think the issue is whether there will be newspapers, but whether there will be newspaper-type newsrooms. And I don't think anyone yet knows for sure whether whatever emerges from this very rapidly changing and it's still evolving multimedia world will be as good, much better, or less good than newspapers in holding all of our governments accountable. I'm trying to be optimistic, but I'm a skeptic by nature. If I was talking to you in 1810, I'd probably be telling you that the steamboat wouldn't work either. The important reality that we have to begin with is that much more rapidly and more dramatically than most of us ever imagined, the economic base of newspapers has eroded, mainly because of competition from the internet and the loss of classified advertising. The company that I last worked for, which is the Tribune Company in Chicago, is now in bankruptcy court. This is a company that owns not only the Chicago Tribune, but also the Los Angeles Times, the Baltimore Sun, the Hartford Courant, the Orlando Sentinel, and many other papers. All of them were very strong and profitable just a few years ago. As a matter of fact, the Tribune Company just a few years ago had annual profits of over 20%. If you had told anyone in the newspaper business back at about the year 2000 that the Tribune Company would be in bankruptcy court in less than 10 years, well, they probably would have thought you were nuts. Papers in Minneapolis and Philadelphia also have filed for bankruptcy. Newspapers in Miami, Detroit, Boston, San Diego, Seattle, Cleveland, and many, many other places are in very serious trouble. What's happened, as Peter Osnos of the Century Foundation has summarized so clearly, is that with the coming of the internet, the suppliers of search engines have built business models that have shut out revenue streams for the creators of the information that they're steering people to. In short, they're distributing information from the New York Times and the Washington Post and many others without paying them for it. And at the same time, they're draining away paid circulation and advertising from those same media companies. This means that most of the internet revenue is going to Yahoo and Google and Microsoft and others who are distributing the news, not to the companies that are generating it. And at the same time, newspapers have lost about 40% of their classified advertising. That's about $7 billion annually to free internet sites like Craigslist. The result is that much less news content is being created by newspapers because the money isn't there to pay for it. And the companies that are making big money from distributing news on the internet aren't generating any of it themselves because they say they're in the technology business and not the information business. What this means, as Leonard Downey and Michael Shudston recently put it in a report commissioned by the Journalism School at Columbia, is that American journalism is at a transformational moment. It's a moment at which the traditional sources of news are losing their dominance, and it's not yet clear what's going to replace them. Right now, there are many fewer newspaper reporters reporting much less news and many fewer newspaper pages than there were just a few years ago. And network television news, long the chief competitor to newspapers before the internet came along, also has been losing its audience, its advertising revenue, and its reporting staffs. At the same time, of course, there's been a huge increase in the number of individuals who have turned to the internet to create websites and blogs, and they're providing a torrent of information that didn't exist before. Some of it is propaganda disguised as news, and some of it is scurrilous rubbish. But of course you had that in some newspapers as well. But a lot of what's going on now is exciting and proving to be very valuable. The result is, well, we don't know where it's going to end up. The ways of doing and delivering journalism are being reinvented even as we're gathered here talking about it. I'll come back to this shortly, but first let me talk for only a minute or so about how much of a loss there's been. It's hard to be precise about this because, as some media people like to say, news isn't electricity. If Green Mountain Power has a blackout, you know right away that your lights are out, your computers aren't working, your television screens are blank, and the ice cream in your freezer is melting. You know what you're missing. But when there's a news blackout, you often don't know what it is that you're not getting. I can't tell you for sure just what you're not getting, but I can give you a few numbers that may help you understand the extent of the problem. When I retired as editor of Newsday in 2003, we had more than 650 people in the newsroom. We had 15 people based in Washington, and we had 5 people overseas. The paper now has 295 editorial employees, which is less than half it that it had when I was there. Now has just 1 person in Washington and no one overseas. In the same time period, the newsroom of the Baltimore Sun shrank from more than 400 people to about 150. The newsroom of the Los Angeles Times shrank from more than 1,100 staffers to fewer than 600. There have been at least comparable, and in many cases more serious cutbacks in Boston, Providence, Seattle, Dallas, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Newark, and almost everywhere else. Back in 2000, the various Tribune Company newspapers, between them, had a combined total of 115 staffers in Washington. Right now, they have fewer than 3 dozen. When George W. Bush took office in 2000, the Cox newspapers, they owned the Atlanta Constitution and 10 other dailies, had about 30 people in the Washington Bureau. 8 years later, with the new Obama administration arriving to deal with 2 wars, a debate over national health care, and the worst economic collapse since 1929, Cox had no Washington Bureau at all. And it's not just Washington and State House bureaus that are seeing cutbacks. Overall, the total number of newspaper editorial employees in the country has declined from about 60,000 in 1992 to only about 40,000 today.